Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the Bible and Archaeology podcast. We're here with Dr. Bob Cargill to talk about the Tower of Babel, Bob.
Tower of Babel.
The famous Tower of Babel, one of the most well-known, and I think, as we're going to talk about today, maybe most misunderstood stories too. One of these things that feels like it hits in every movie, every children's story, despite some of what happens with it. It's one of those iconic images from the Bible. In an early part of Genesis, that if you're trying to do I'm going to read my Bible in a year, you probably make it through this story.
Yeah, you get to Genesis 11.
Before you stop.
Yeah.
But within that, maybe not quite the story or the point of the story that everybody thinks that it is.
Well, I think it's because they generally skip Genesis 10, right? They get to the flood, and they read the flood, Genesis 6 through 9, and then they start seeing all these names in 10, and they skip it, and then they get to Genesis 11, I go, ooh, Babel. And then they start seeing about promises and Abraham, and they're like, eh. And so, but the Tower of Babel, it's also a nice Sunday school story because of the lesson that is generally taught in.
Well, I think this is a good point. Generally taught.
Because
this is going to be one of the points of conversation here. Is
correct.
What is the lesson?
Correct.
If there is one that we should take away.
Correct.
From the Tower of Babel, because what would you say the general lesson is when the story is normally taught? What's the takeaway?
Oh no, the story that I was taught growing up in Sunday school was, all right, if you try to be like God, if you're too proud, if you try to, because they're trying to build a tower up into heaven, and so they're trying to be like God, and God's going to smack you down if you try to be like God. If you don't all speak the same language, if you're not all on the same page, things are going to fall apart. So it was the haughtiness, it was the pride. You're trying too much to be like God, so be humble, or God will knock you down.
I feel like the pride and punishment,
right?
Not Pride and Prejudice here, pride and punishment in Genesis 11 is definitely the message that I got from this one growing up. Mm-hmm. But we want to complicate that one a little bit today. Yeah. It's not to say that reading can't be there.
Sure.
But to ask the question of, is this the original reading? Is this a reading that is being foregrounded most in Genesis 11? Mm-hmm. Or is this a reading that has come in later and kind of just taken over the tradition?
Right.
Much in the same way, I think, as we'll talk about with the tower itself, of the iconic image of this story.
Right.
We're calling it the Tower of Babel. But is it really about the tower? How important is the tower to Genesis versus maybe how important does the tower become later?
Well, it's also, the concept of a tower has been kind of co-opted because I think most people think of it, and at least the way it's drawn in iconography, is Leaning Tower of Pisa.
Yeah.
Right. It's a narrow cylindrical tower. It goes, or like a skyscraper.
Very European in imagery. I mean, and a part of that's because it's in a lot of European art.
Correct. But what we're talking about here is something very different.
So can we start there before we jump into the text? I think because fixing the way we're thinking about it in our minds, the image we have in our minds first can be helpful. So if it's not that type of tower, what's the type of tower that people should be imagining?
Right. So where I teach students, I say you should be thinking of a ziggurat. Now, what's a ziggurat? A ziggurat is a southern Mesopotamian, it's a pyramid, but it's not like an Egyptian pyramid. Egyptian pyramids are tombs.
Right.
They're big, phallic, they're big structures that are used to bury an Egyptian king, a pharaoh. A ziggurat it's more like a temple. It's a temple. It's a structure on which worship is done. Mm-hmm. So it's a big, tall structure. Usually it's stepped, and there's steps within it. You can go inside of it. But the purpose of a ziggurat is to elevate oneself so that worship can be done. And this is very common. It's a high place. It's an artificial high place. Why? Because you're in the desert in southern Mesopotamia. And this is, think of the Persian Gulf, think of southern Iraq, Kuwait down there. It's flat, right? It's a desert. So we always think of when you want to be closer to God, you go up on a high mountain, right? You climb the mountain so that you can be closer to the heavens.
But if you don't have a mountain around.
Right. So you have to build an artificial mountain. By the way, the opposite is true When you're far from God, you're usually in a cave or you're in a valley. So you get the 23rd Psalm, though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death. It's when you're far from God, you're in a valley. And when you're close to God, you're on a high mountain, soaring with the eagles, things like this. So you want to be closer to God. When you're in the desert, you build an artificial mountain, which is a ziggurat. That's what we need to be thinking about when we think of the Tower of Babel.
Okay, so let's turn here to Genesis 11 and do the quick reread.
Sure.
Because again, I think this is one of those stories that everybody knows, but maybe it's been a while since you've actually read it, or maybe you have never really read it. Right. You just have that common idea of what everybody thinks this is. So we'll read through 1 through 9 first, fairly quickly, before we return to something. So Genesis 11:1. Now the whole earth had one language and the same words. And as they migrated from the east, they came upon a plain in the land of Shinar and settled there. And they said to one another, "Come, let us make bricks and burn them thoroughly." And they had brick for stone and bitumen for mortar. Then they said, "Come, let us build ourselves a city and a tower with its top in the heavens, and let us make a name for ourselves. Otherwise we shall be scattered abroad the face of the whole earth." And the Lord came down to see the city and the tower which mortals had built. And the Lord said, "Look, they are one people, and they all have one language, and this is only the beginning of what they will do. Nothing that they propose to do will now be impossible for them. Come, let us go down and confuse their language there, so that they will not understand one another's speech." So the Lord scattered them abroad from there over the face of all the earth, and they left off building the city. Therefore it was called Babel, because the Lord confused the language of all the earth. And from there the Lord scattered them abroad over the face of all the earth. Okay, so if we can start at the top, the point of the story. We said there's a historic interpretation. The point of the story is the pride, which I think people can point to some things like, let's make a name for ourselves. We're going to build this tower to reach into the heavens. Are those fair readings of what those lines mean? Are those lines really about, pride and haughtiness when it says we want to make a name for ourselves and we want to build this tower up? Or is that misreading the meaning of those kinds of phrases?
If I say yes and no, do I sound too much like a scholar?
That's the correct answer.
Both, right? Yeah. It's is it this or that? Yes, right. What we need to remember is, and we need to introduce a term, right? The term is etiology. So this is an explanation for an otherwise naturally occurring phenomenon. So this is a story about how something came to be. The story might not be true, but they're trying to explain the way something is or why something is the way it is. So that's an etiology, okay? The first etiology is they're trying to explain ziggurats. So why are these things here? What are they? And they're saying these things are bad. Number one, they're defining ziggurats as bad. They're high places of worship. They're trying to get up close. Clearly, this is not in the Israelite tradition. When this was written down, they're seeing these as foreign. These are Mesopotamian. These are over there by Babylon. We'll talk about that in a second. And so these temples, this isn't the Jerusalem temple, right? So these are worship structures that are bad. So they're going to have a bad outcome. And so they're trying to explain the explanation of where these towers came from, and clearly they have a bad outcome. So that's the first etiology. The second, I would say, is they're buying into this notion that maybe they got it from their knowledge. Remember, there's the historical setting of when the literary setting of when this is supposed to be happening in history,
right?
And when the story is actually being written down, when it's actually being written and told. So this is supposed to be happening, thousands of years prior to when it's actually being crafted. The story is actually being written and redacted and put into the Bible.
Right.
So by the time it's being redacted and put into the Bible, they know about Egypt. They know about pyramids. They know about ziggurats. There's a knowledge because they have the Greek histories, and they have maybe somebody's traveled to Egypt, or maybe somebody's been to Mesopotamia. Maybe they're in Babylon, right? Maybe they see these things and they want to write a story about why these things are bad. So they're going to oftentimes take these things that are there presently with them and retroject them back into the stories of antiquity.
Right.
So they probably know, like we know today, that people who make big, tall buildings are usually people who like to make a name for themselves. You don't build a big, tall skyscraper and not put your name on the top of it. People who tend to do that put their name up on the top of it, right? And they name, building, big, ostentatious, right? Herod the Great did this all the time, right? He wanted to build these big buildings and you knew it was Herod the Great's stuff. So you have this second idea that, come let us build ourselves a city. Cities are bad, right? Especially in early Genesis.
In the early stuff, you have
Right.
that like,
Cities.
this is that classic nomad
Correct.
versus settled.
Correct. You should just have your herds. And if you do have you're just wandering around, relying on God, relying on the deity to provide for you. If you're building a city and building storehouses and things, that's bad. So cities are bad. That's where all the sin happens, right? Vegas. And let's build a tower with its top in the heavens. Let us make a name for ourselves, or else, and here's where they're foreshadowing, we're going to be scattered on the face of the earth. So this is just like you do in Esther, right? You're going to build a gallows to hang someone else on, and you ended up being, or else we're going to be scattered. And of course, they end up scattered.
Right.
So this is true that it's about building, these things are being built a name for themselves and things like that. That's always true. But it's an ideology that's going to set up why these structures are bad.
So we have some of it, because we have multiple potential, let's say, ideologies happening at the same time.
Yeah,
some of it talking about cities, maybe. Some of it talking about towers. We've got another one coming in. We have this emphasis on language. I mean, it's in the first sentence. Now the whole earth had one language and the same words.
Right.
And then when we end it again, we have the confuse the language. So we very clearly are foregrounding a concept of language at the beginning and language at the end.
That's what I argue this story is all about.
And so this is where we want to turn for a moment. We'll come back to some other things.
Right.
Why, if this feels so prominent at the front and the back and mixed throughout, why doesn't it get more attention as what this story is all about? Why does something like pride take more of a center seat?
Because so I do this with my kids all the time, right? Sometimes I will tell a story, a parable. Jesus did this all the time, right? You tell a story you tell the parable of the sower, you tell the parable of the lost coin, or whatever it is, and you're trying to get across a moral or a principle. You're trying to teach, right? But sometimes the timing of the story is done to convey something else. So in teaching one concept, right? I think today I want to teach you about not being selfish, or I want to teach you about something else. But the story, the timing of the story and how you do that is actually conveying another principle that you're trying to set up. And that's what's going on here. The story might be about, here's why ziggurats are bad, and here's why pride is bad. But the positioning of this story in Genesis chapter 11, right after the flood, and there's only 8 surviving people, and presumably they all speak Hebrew, the language of creation, right? There's only been so many people, right? And so they all get off the ark, they all speak Hebrew, and then here's this genealogy that everybody likes to skip in chapter 10. Here are the people, and apparently it's this person became the father of this nation, and this individual became and they name all of these different nations that apparently have all these different languages. So how did we go from 8 people getting off the ark to all of these generations with all of these different languages when we know that languages take a long time to develop, right? That anthropology of language, it takes a long time. If you study linguistics, right? Take a long time to develop. How did you get from 8 people speaking one language to, in just a few generations, so many different languages? I think that's why the story sits where it does. There's not enough time to develop all of these different languages. So let me tell you why ziggurats are bad. Let me tell you why pride is bad. But in doing so, they tell this story about, now the whole earth had one language and the same words, presumably Hebrew, right?
Well, that's what they want to say. I mean, that becomes the argument that it is, we would like this language to have been Hebrew.
The language of creation, it's this. And then, so they're all working together. Everybody can understand each other. Everybody's on the same page. And God, and I love this, God comes down, the Lord comes down to see the city. And again, he mentions they all have one language. And he says, look, they're one people, they all have one language. And this is the only beginning of what they can do. And nothing they propose to do will be impossible for them. The idea being they can build this tower up into the heavens. And they come, let us go down and confuse their language so they won't be able to understand each other. The contractors won't, the builders won't be able to understand each other. And if they confuse the speech, they won't be able to accomplish this task. So the Lord scattered them from abroad, and he scattered their language, and therefore it's called Babel. Come back to that. And they, because the Lord confused their language and scattered them all over the face of the earth. And so without specifically saying it, what they're doing is they're explaining how they went from 8 people who at the beginning of the story, right? 8 people at the end of chapter 9 all have the same language. Then they go through all of these genealogies, and all of these people, according to Genesis 11, all had the same language still. They didn't speak all these different languages.
Except like a problem with it is in Genesis 10, and again, how you want to place the genealogies where they go.
Right.
Genesis 10 gives us, the descendants of so-and-so who have their own language, the descendants of so-and-so who have their own language. So we are like jumping again back in time, but then forward.
So then what this text is trying to do is to say, let me explain how the descendants of, Shem, the descendants of Ham, the descendants of Japhet, right? How did they come in they named the generations there. It's not that many generations, and yet they all have their own language. How is that possible? Right? 4 generations, and you have a completely different, it's not just that you adopted somebody else's language, you developed a completely different system of how did that come to be? Oh, let me tell you a story.
Let me tell you a story about when they built a tower. And I want to cycle back. We'll come back to the name here in a second. Because it is a question that I think needs to be asked. It gets foregrounded. It gets called the story of the Tower of Babel. But I think the tower, when you really look back over the text, is a lot less important in this than our memory of it makes it seem to be. Because the question I have is, how much of this story really cares about the tower? How important is the tower in Genesis? Because we get it tied with, let us build ourselves a city and a tower, right? And then in verse 5, a city and a tower, the Lord comes down to see. But then when we go down towards the end, what they leave off building in verse 8 is just the city. So tower doesn't really matter to Genesis?
It's, again, cities are bad. And again, I come back, so there's etiologies, stories of where things come from, and then there's etymologies. And this is the explanation of the origin of a word. And this is different from entomology, which is the study of bugs, right? Right. I had I loved my entomology professor when I took it as a biology major at Fresno State. So we always talked about etiologies, etymologies, and entomologies. Right, that's the right word. I'm saying the right word, right?
I think so.
Bugs, yeah.
I can't say I'm a bug study specialist.
Right.
Correct us in the comments if we are wrong.
Right, but it's this idea that there are the origin stories of things and how they came to be, and then there's the origins of words. And notice that the explanation of Babel that they give here. So the Lord scattered them abroad from there over the face of the earth, and they left off building the city. So this is your point.
Right.
They're not building the tower. It said, we're going to build a city and a tower. And then they stopped building the city.
Yeah.
But the understanding is
it's both, which is
tower in the city.
Yeah. Some of the conversation that the two go hand in hand. Right. You're not going to have a tower removed from the city, but also in this context, the cities have towers.
Is it Temanaki or what's the one up in Babylon that's the ziggurat that's in the center?
In the center, right? These are focal points of the city.
And so they're not going to build a tower if they're not going to build this city. But he goes, therefore it was called Babel. This is Beit Lamed, because the Lord confused their language, and the verb there is Beit Lamed. So it's not Beit Lamed, it's Beit Lamed. So they're using a different verb to try to explain away why so it got a different name. Now Babel, we say Babel like blah, 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 but it's actually Babylon, right? It's getting this name Babylon, whereas Balal means to confuse. So this is either a folk etymology or it's they're really stretching it here. You know why are they doing this? But they're trying to take the idea of the confusion of the language and explaining where Babel, this name Babel, comes from, to try to explain the origin, I'm assuming, of the city of Babylon.
The city of Babylon, which is a big city. It has some of these ziggurats attached to it.
Yeah.
I think this also brings up another, if we want to throw on the table, because we're going to look at a couple traditions that grow out of Genesis.
Yeah.
Where different interpretations that maybe aren't so centered just on pride start to go. One of those that gets pushed forward by somebody like our friend Josephus is the potential of some anti-imperialist concerns in this, because he goes a different way by tying it to Nimrod. But if you want to tie this to Babylon, and they're this city and look at what happens to them, you can start to see some potential readings for anti-imperial sentiments.
What you won't see is traditions that are surrounding the true reason I think this story exists, and that is to explain how you went from one language to so many foreign languages in such a short period of time. That's why the story's there. They needed it, and what's the answer? God did it miraculously.
But that's kind of boring.
Well, but you don't want to just that's the reality is there was a long period of time and these people spread out over time and they developed these different Semitic languages, right? They developed over time. They would much rather have God just go poof and do it. So what you're going to do is you're going to pick up all of the other traditions of the tower, of the city. Remember, Babylon was the place that destroyed Jerusalem.
Right.
So you're going to pick up on this. You're going to pick up on other aspects of this story, not on the part that, is disguising the reality of it took a long time to develop these languages.
Yeah. So we'll lay out a couple here of other interpretations outside of pride.
Yeah.
And maybe also, as you're saying here, outside of some of this, the development of language, whether you're like, they don't care or it gets a little boring or they want to go somewhere else. They pick up, and we're just going to look at three. There's a lot of different traditions that grow out of this, but we want to look at three that are prominent within the record for some of their influence because they go a different number of paths, drawing off of the same source text in Genesis, either picking up some of these maybe imperialist concerns, some of the concern of like, well, if the top of the tower is in the heavens, what exactly are they trying to do within that? And then returning to the language, but also spinning it into a different way. Because the Tower of Babel, again, isn't really about the Tower of Babel for most anybody. Until it comes to be that much later.
The Tower of Babel is a fun story, but it just kind of gets glossed over there.
It's quick.
Until people later in the Second Temple period start saying, hey, well, this is a fun story. And Josephus is one of these who in his Antiquities, remember Josephus's Antiquities is a retelling of the history of the Jews, starting with the Bible. So Josephus starts his Antiquities by retelling from Genesis on the stories with his own little drash, right? With his own little interpretation of these stories.
He was looking to bump up that page count. And he returned to some sources.
I'm not just going to tell you the Herodians. I'm not just going to tell you the Hasmoneans. I want to start from the beginning. And a lot of it is just a recap of not just Genesis and Exodus and the biblical stories, but also the Septuagint's take on this, how they translate it sometimes, how this oral tradition in the interpretation, and sometimes some of these other Jubilees, Enoch, some of these other texts that have been written that were just kind of accepted as part of the tradition, the oral Torah, that would end up being the Pharisaic tradition, the Mishnah and the Talmud. He's incorporating some of these stories into his history.
So we're going to turn to some of what Josephus has to say about the Tower of Babel. We're not going to read all of what Josephus has to say because Josephus, being Josephus, can be verbose at times.
Yes, he can.
And so he takes these 9 verses and expands them out, brings some details in. But we want to touch on a couple parts from this to look at the different path Josephus takes. And so when he's opening up this section, he says, "Now it was Nimrod who excited them to such an affront and contempt of God. He was the grandson of Ham, the son of Noah, a bold man and of great strength and hand. He persuaded them not to ascribe it to God. And so he says, gradually changed the government into tyranny, seeing no other way of turning men from the fear of God, but to bring them into a constant dependence on his power. He also said he would be revenged on God if he should have a mind to drown the world again, for that he would build a tower too high for the waters to be able to reach, and that he would avenge himself on God for destroying their forefathers." And so they do build a tower. They don't spare any pains, and it was soon higher than anyone expected. So let's stop there.
Yeah. So Nimrod, who is this guy, by the way? This is the mighty hunter.
Mighty hunter, mighty warrior. And depending on whether you look at the Hebrew text or the Septuagint, he is a giant. They take that mighty and he becomes a giant. And then he grows into this thing of, is he just a giant? And when he's a giant hunter, is he hunting giants? Or is he a giant that is fighting against God? Which is a part of where he goes and a part of what Josephus is drawing.
And Josephus does this on a regular basis. If there are 2 traditions, by the way, the Targums do this as well. If there are 2 traditions, he will incorporate both of them. So he'll find a way to say, and this is this, and then this happened. So they'll incorporate both of the 2 traditions into one story.
As a good scholar, he says, yes, I would like both. Is it this or is it that? Would I be wrong to say both? And Josephus says both. So we're drawing on the tradition of Josephus. But I do think it's interesting. He does lean into some more of this anti-imperial reading by tying it not just to Nimrod. Now we've got a nice character who's the source. But that he turns the government into tyranny. And then as a part of that says, let's build ourselves a tower.
Who did that? My question is, who else does that? Who else wants to overthrow a tyrannical government? Let's call them the Seleucids, right? Who wants to overthrow this tyrannical government, this monarchy, and we're going to take it back for us. And then when they become the Hasmoneans, they end up becoming just as bad, if not worse, than the people they overthrew. Solomon did the same thing, right? He gets called a pharaoh, right? Now and Josephus, not a fan of the Hasmoneans.
So you think there's a little Hasmonean flair coming in?
I think Josephus doesn't like tyranny, right? And so he sees this and he's reading this into the story of Nimrod. He's like, he's going to come take it over and then he's going to become, you stare at the abyss too long, right? You become this thing. And this is what happens. We read this in literature all the way down through today, right? You become the thing you're trying to overthrow because it's hard to give up power. Absolute power corrupts absolutely. And so Nimrod, now that he's built this thing, is like, by the way, I'll take out God.
When he does,
he killed my daddy.
This is a part of the tower build that I really like in Josephus because it does play on the one hand into some of the violence and fighting, like fighting against God within the tower, but also in a way that does very clearly draw on the context. This comes right after the flood.
Right.
If you're aware that God just flooded everybody, might you be inclined to try to make sure that God can't do that again? I know there's a promise and God's supposed to not, but what if maybe we have a place we can go to, which I think is a really fun element of why does this show up where it does? We got some genealogies, we have some language, but it's also right after the flood, and now we've got a really tall thing. Might that be a part of why it ends up? Joseph seems to find some resonance there.
Yeah, to make sure it doesn't happen again. As opposed to the tack that First Enoch takes, which is to say, oh, no. God wasn't punishing people for their sin. God was saving people from these giants, from eating all the people. That's why he flooded people. So God wasn't, Josephus is of the tack here that's like, no. He did that to punish everybody. And apparently he might do it again. So Nimrod's going to make sure he's going to build a tower high enough
you can get away from
water can't get as you can get up on top. You can survive it. And then you can go after God.
Yeah. So an interesting turn there. And if we continue going on, but God, right, seeing things not like in the way that stuff is going, caused a tumult among them and produced in them diverse languages, causing a multitude of languages so they can't understand one another. Mm-hmm. Therefore, the place where they built the tower is now called Babylon because of the confusion of that language, which they readily understood before. For the Hebrews, by that word, mean Babel, confusion. And Josephus adds, God sent a storm of wind and overthrew the tower and gave everyone his peculiar language. And for that reason, it was that the city was called Babylon. So a little bit of double down. But we also jump into here something that doesn't come up in Genesis, where they leave off building the city, no mention of the tower. Josephus does a little fix. It gets knocked over by the breeze.
Yeah, it's a plot hole fix. You get this all the time in the Second Temple period. But they took out, they're going to stop the city, but what happened to the tower? Is it still standing there? What happens? Josephus comes by and says, no, God came along and knocked down that too.
Yeah, so you thought you built a nice tower that you were going to get into heaven or fight God with. Well, you can't get there first off.
Right.
And then your construction's pretty shoddy too, because it's going to get knocked over.
By the wind.
And so don't go looking for it. The tower is not there anymore. Something that does feel different between, I guess, some of his anti-imperial concerns with the Genesis, whether it's the Hasmoneans or whether it's tied to memories of Babylon or a subtle critique of the Romans, payroll that he might be sitting on, is in Genesis, they have a real concern of they don't want to go other places. So like they want to remain in one place. We want to stay here. We don't want to get scattered. We want to stay here. We want to stay here. It's God that comes in and says, no. I'm going to make you go other places. So that doesn't feel super imperial in Genesis.
I think it's a critique because Nimrod goes from being this mighty hunter to being a bad guy.
Being a bad guy.
So he becomes a heel in WrestleMania terms, right? He goes from being a good guy to being a bad guy. And this is one of the we got to do a thing on Nimrod as well. So Enoch has a narrative, a hero narrative, right? An arc. Melchizedek gets one that just expands. Elijah gets one, and Nimrod gets one, and he becomes a popular figure because he gets mentioned very little, and then he becomes a big deal in the end. And I think what he's doing is he's trying to talk about the fate of Nimrod here, and Josephus is trying to say, by the way, the tower is gone. By the way, when you read Josephus about Noah's Ark, he actually says, now you can go see it to this day. It's still sitting up there, but the Tower of Babel, it's gone.
And part of why, if you're thinking to yourself, well, why is Nimrod getting connected in this? When we read about Nimrod in Genesis 10, he gets connected with the founding of some cities, one of them being this one. Yeah. And so you have a resonance there with that name in reference to him. And here, his conversion into being a giant also doesn't hurt him because this then opens the door to some of those, did the giants build the tower style of theories that grow, because if you got a really big tower, you might need some really big hands to help you build such a large tower.
Well, and Babylon has some other traditions as well, and that people were uncertain about its founding that come down into history as well that might tie into what Josephus is talking about here.
But taking it a different path, he still brings in the language, but touching on some other things with his Nimrod critique, with some of the destruction of the tower. But the tower has very clearly grown in importance. I think from the Genesis one, where it's very minimal, to Josephus has given it a lot more treatment. Okay, so then let's move along, if we can, to, I think, one of my favorite versions of this, Pseudo-Jonathan, because Pseudo-Jonathan is a weirdo who likes to add in details. If you're interested in more, see our bonus podcasts on Patreon. Pseudo-Jonathan comes up quite frequently. because Pseudo-Jonathan in his expansions of things adds in a couple minor details that are very telling of his style.
Now, for those of you who haven't seen that video, Pseudo-Jonathan is a targum. A targum is
Yes.
an Aramaic translation of the Hebrew text. I use the word translation very loosely. It is a translation, but it's also like a sermon. It's a translation, but at times they'll replace a word with an updated word, or they'll explain something like, by the way, that city today is called this, or by the way, something else happened that you should know about, and then they'll just go off on a tangent. And so they're part translations, part commentaries. It's like a little mini midrash, depending on where you are. Some targums are more faithful to the text, word for word. This would be like onkelos. Other targums, like Pseudo-Jonathan, are incredibly creative and inventive.
So we want to look at a couple of these creative expansions that Pseudo-Jonathan gets into. We're not going to read all of it, but just picking on a couple that show some of the change in his concerns. And so in Genesis 11:1 in Pseudo-Jonathan, right, the whole earth is of one language. They were speaking in the holy language in which the world was created from the beginning.
The language of creation is Hebrew, apparently.
Yes.
That's when God said, let there be light. He was doing it in Hebrew, just like it says there in the Bible.
So you have here a bit of that clarity of Pseudo-Jonathan coming in to say, you've heard it was one language. Well, let me tell you what one language it was.
Right. Ivrit. It was Hebrew.
That one language matters. And so they move along. They're going to build themselves a city and a tower with its top reaching to the heavens. Sounds very similar. Let us make for ourselves an idol at its top, and we will put a sword in its hand, and it will make battle arrays before him, before we are scattered over the face of the earth.
Time out. So they're going to build a tower up into the heavens, but then they're going to put this pestle, this idol, up on the top, and then they're going to put a sword in its hand, and it's going to make battle arrays before him to do what? To fight against God?
I think we're fighting. That's what it feels. You are fighting.
It's similar to what...
it's similar to Nimrod.
Well, it's similar to what Josephus is saying about Nimrod, right?
Yeah.
To defend against whatever God is going to come down and do to us.
Whatever plans God might have, Nimrod is one path to say, he's going to do it. Nimrod is this giant,
Remember,
mighty
Nimrod's
hunter.
a bad guy now.
He's a bad guy.
Fight against God.
And he's going to do that. But here in Pseudo-Jonathan, they're now going to make a divine representation of something to engage in divine combat with a divine presence that just flooded everybody. And so now getting into, they're reaching up into the heavens. It feels like for a very different purpose than in Genesis 11, where why do you want to get into the heavens? Is it your haughtiness? Do you want to be like God? It's kind of ambiguous.
They're going to fight God, it sounds like.
Here, Pseudo-Jonathan seems to clarify. You got to get up that high so that your sword can poke God. You got to be a little bit closer. You got to get into the heavens in order to do these things. But still, they don't want to be scattered. They're trying to avoid that. And so if we move on, the Lord said to the 70 angels who were standing before him, come, let's go down, and we're going to confound their language. And with him were the 70 angels corresponding to the 70 nations.
There you go.
And each one, the language of his people and the mark of its writing were in his hand. And he scattered them from there all over the face of the earth into 70 languages. And each one did not know what his neighbor was saying. Therefore, they called it Babel, because there the Lord confused their languages. 70 angels, Bob.
Yeah.
Why 70 angels?
Well, the reference to the 70 angels makes me think about the reference in Deuteronomy 32 about when God is apportioning the land to the people. And he says in 32, I think you said it was
8 and 9.
Verses 8 and 9, that he apportions all the, let me grab my trusty accordance here. Deuteronomy 32:8, when the Most High, so it's a reference to Elyon here. So it's not the divine name, it's not Elohim, it's Elyon. When the Most High apportioned the nations, when he divided humankind, he fixed the boundaries of the peoples according to the number of, and then depending on what translation you read, you're going to get something here. The MT says sons of Israel, B'nai Israel. The Septuagint says the angels of God, which is completely different. The Dead Sea Scrolls say the sons of God, not sons of Israel, the sons of God. And the context, because of verse 9, the Lord's own portion was his people, Jacob, his allotted share. And so the NRSV, I think contextually and I think correctly, says according to the number of the gods. Again, this is an early polytheistic text. There were lots of gods. You just only were supposed to worship Yahweh. You're only supposed to worship the Lord. But over time, monotheism came to mean monolatry, right? Monotheism used to mean monolatry. You only worship one God, but then it was the only existence of one God. And so they had to change this text to mean that Elyon deportioned all these texts, all these peoples, all this land to all these different gods. They said, well, we can't have that. So they put the words sons of God, like, the angels. And then so the Septuagint changed that to the angels of God, which what that would mean. And then the MT comes along and changes it to sons of Israel. So the reason I bring all this up is you also have texts, Enoch and these others, about these 70 angels that they go back and talk about in the Targums that were created on the first day of creation. So you have these 70 angels that are going to come along. They're with him. They're part of the court of God, of the Lord, which is the reason why he says, let us make man in our image, right? This is not the Trinity, right? This is not the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit. Let us make man. He's using the royal we. Let us do this. And it's because there is this holy army. These are the angels of the Lord. And they're always referring to this in the plural. God has these angels. He's got an army, right? Adonai Sabaoth, right? Yahweh Sabaoth. Mm-hmm. It's just the Lord of hosts. What is a host? It's the army of God. And he's coming to these guys and he's saying, and he scattered there from over into earth 70 languages, representing the 70 nations, which are representative of all of the peoples of the earth. And those 70 nations, these 70 people, these are the angels of God, the sons of God that are representative of all of these different peoples.
So we then directly tie, we got a number of languages for a very specific reason. We're moving from one, which was the first language, trying to give some clarity for us there in Pseudo-Jonathan. The first language, change on the tower, still more emphasis on the tower than Genesis, because it's providing a very direct service for some divine combat in a way that Genesis doesn't explicitly mention.
Right.
The reference of an idol, and then 70 languages that are going to come out, which also nicely matches up with, the number of the supposed descendants from Noah that are going to split into these 70s. So we've got a nice pairing. Isn't that very...
So but you do have these hints within the Bible when God's apportioning the lands of the people to these, I think originally said gods, but then it's the sons of God, which are the angels. And here's your 70 angels. Yeah. So now you've got in the Targums an explicit reference to going from one language, Hebrew, to the 70 languages that represent all of the nations, the descendants of Noah, that are mentioned right there in Genesis chapter 10.
So a bit of a different turn and fix, still continuing, maybe, returning more a little bit to some of the language concern, but drawing on some different aspects within tower ideas. Okay, so Pseudo-Jonathan goes his own way. And then let's turn last to Jubilees.
Yeah, Jubilees.
And Jubilees does a lot of weird stuff with a lot of everything. And so, again, we're going to focus specifically on a couple things within Jubilees' turn of the tower. And so they say here, there's a leading into the context, humanity has now become evil through the perverse plan to build themselves a city and a tower. So very explicitly negative with city and tower, like you've talked about before. Let us ascend through it to heaven. And then they begin to build, and so we get some nice construction descriptions of the mud that they're using. They built it for 43 years. Yeah. The height was 4,433 cubits and 2 spans.
Right.
And the width was about 203 bricks. And so very specific tower description here.
We don't get this anywhere else.
Right? No, and a real elevation from what tower in Genesis, we're not even building the tower by the end, to let me tell you its height, its width, the dimensions of some bricks. And so then God says the same kind of concern. Let's go down and confuse their language. So the Lord went down with him to see the city and the tower that humanity had built. He confused every sound of their language. No one any longer understood what the other was saying. They stopped building. For this reason, the whole land of Shinar was named Babel, because there God confused all the languages of humanity. From there they were dispersed into their cities, each according to their languages and nations. The Lord sent a wind at the tower and tipped it to the ground. It is now between Ashur and Babylon in the land of Shinar. He named it Collapse.
There you go. So, again, Jubilees is, I think we would argue, a rewrite of these early Pentateuchal books, Genesis and Exodus. It's not necessarily a paraphrase. Sometimes it's pretty word for word, and not word for word, but it's pretty faithful to the original text. Other times it's filling in the gaps. The point of Jubilees, by the way, is to retell this story with a specific calendar. So that's what they're trying to do. They're telling the story in this calendar.
Yeah, because this opens with during the 33rd Jubilee.
Correct, and it's written about 150 BC. It's written after Enoch, and it looks like maybe Josephus is getting some of his traditions of knocking down the tower from Jubilees. He's drawing from the Hebrew Bible. He's drawing from Jubilees, but he's calling it the collapse here. So the collapse with a capital C. This is going to be the fall of the tower. So he's telling you exactly where it is, and he's telling you, this is what it's about. This is where we got all of these foreign languages. So we went from it being just about pride to them saying, no. This is where all of these foreign languages came from.
Well, I do think it's interesting in this one, a notable omission, it feels notable to me at least, we don't have a reference to them making their name great. No. Which is one of these foregrounded things in the Genesis version that leads to some of that pride reading. They're going to make their name great. Here, no mention of name concerns, but we're going to ascend through it to heaven. So Pseudo-Jonathan, we're going to build it and put an idol at the top so it can fight. Here, Stairway to Heaven, let's call it. We will be able to get up and get in.
And if you look at ziggurats in southern Mesopotamia, you can climb up the steps on the outside, but they also have internal steps. You could go into them. So this is why I say they're temples, but you can go in and they have internal steps. So this idea of go through it to heaven is possible because they do have internal passageways to ascend to the top.
And one detail we want to tag here at the end, because you mentioned the capital C collapse, which is weird. Because you're like, okay, it gets a name, but now it's a different name,
it's like the exile with a capital E. Yeah. This is the collapse of the Tower of Babel,
and it's not Babel, it's not confusion, it's not spread. We're going to call it collapse. And you're like, sure, the thing collapsed, it tipped over. Great, you named it the most obvious thing.
Sure.
We want to jump ahead a little bit because this draws on I think one of the questions of, well, why does it show up where it does? We talked some about post-flood concerns, genealogy concerns. And Jubilees sees a little bit of a different concern with what comes next in setting up Abram. If we turn ahead in Jubilees a little bit to chapter 12. Then the Lord said to me, open his mouth, his here being Abram. Open Abram's mouth and his ears to hear and speak with his tongue in the revealed language. For from the day of the collapse, it had disappeared from the mouths of all humanity. I opened his mouth, his ears, and his lips, and he began to speak Hebrew in the language of creation.
There it is again. So this is what happened. So there was one language. It was a language of creation. It was Hebrew. And that was the language on the ark. One language, 8 people. And then all of a sudden, Ham, Shem, and Japhet have all these generations. And how do you explain in such a short period of time where all these languages come from? God had to do it. It had to be a miracle because you don't have enough time to develop all these languages. So boom, Tower of Babel. But in the canonical story of the Tower of Babel, that's not the emphasis. It's this tower. And then they don't talk about it very much. So it was placed there as a quickie story. Ziggurats are bad, right? Towers are bad. Babylon, this is where it gets its name, although not really. But this is what we're going to say. Babylon, bad, foregrounding it. Right? The exile is still a long way away, but Babylon's going to be bad. Just get it in your head. City's bad, Ziggurat's bad, Babylon bad. But over time, the story of the Tower of Babel is going to come to this. By the way, now that everything is expanded and it's a diaspora religion and we're coming back and you've got all these other Greeks and Persians and Romans, and now you have, oh, by the way, this is where all these languages came from. And how about Hebrew? Remember, Josephus is always trying to talk about the importance of Hebrew, the mother tongue, right? Abram has this revealed to him by God, right? So God teaches Abraham Hebrew. It hadn't been spoken since the collapse. So since the Tower of Babel fell down, and now he's going to learn it. And Abrams goes and reads all of his father's books that were written in Hebrew, but nobody could read. And then I love this very last bit that he says here. He took his father's books, he read them, and then it says shortly after this, was it after this or was it before this? That it was before this. In Jubilees, you have this great text when Adam and Eve get kicked out of the Garden of Eden. It says, and at that point, all of the animals that were in the garden with Adam and Eve, their mouths were closed. And it says, because they used to converse with one another, but now they can't. And it was this quick thing on language that explains how you have a talking snake and how you have Balaam's talking donkey. Apparently in the Garden of Eden, according to Jubilees, they used to talk to each other, which would have been in Hebrew, right? But then God shut their mouths and only Adam and Eve could talk after that. So apparently it wasn't just the humans that talked to each other in Hebrew, but it was the animals in the Garden of Eden. But they got their mouths shut on the way out. And Hebrew was gone from the collapse of the Tower of Babel up until God himself retaught Hebrew to Abraham there in Jubilees 12.
And it does feel like an interesting way to address the concern of, okay, well, if there are, Pseudo-Jonathan, 78 angels coming down, and how do we end up with the right language? How do we know? Okay, well, there's a very clear way, it's God takes their own portion, Deuteronomy, you have that option. Mm-hmm. Or the option of, well, that language just ceased. So nobody else had it until someone is specifically chosen, Abram, and then given. And so now you have a nice chronological reason to say, well, why does that story of the loss and the spread of language need to come after the flood? One, genealogical, sure. And then Abram as well as another of, that's why it's ours and why we're select.
It's an interesting parallel, this of it could also be explaining, hey, why haven't as many people heard of Hebrew, right? You've heard of all these other languages, Greek and all, the Akkadian language and the Aramaic, and why haven't they heard of Hebrew? You get a similar apologetic taking place in the letter of Aristeas, or the letter of Pseudo-Aristeas, that is the story of how the Septuagint, how the Greek translation of the Hebrew Bible came to be so authentic, right? You get this story of how they picked the 72 scribes, 6 from each of the 12 tribes, and they sent them off, and they came back, and lo and behold, the translations were so perfect that it had to be a miracle, and they declared, that this had to be a perfect Greek translation. Therefore, you can trust this Greek translation. And you have in the mouth of the king, how come none of these, if this law is so good and so perfect, this Hebrew law, this Jewish law, how come none of them are in any of the library, the Library of Alexandria? How come none of it? And it's because, it was written in this special Hebrew language that nobody could read. Mm-hmm. But that's why we have to get it translated. So you have an apologetic similar to that here in Jubilees of why doesn't anybody know this? Because it was taken away and now it's given back, but just to these guys. And it's written at 150 here. You have the same thing. The Septuagint is being translated into Greek from about 250 to about the first century. So you get these stories of how Hebrew is special and how Hebrew is secret and how it's being revealed to a certain special amount of people. I just find these stories about language and about scribal activity, especially in the late Second Temple period, to be so special. But again, it all starts with the Tower of Babel to explain where language comes from in the first place.
The story of a tower that's not really about the tower
until
it becomes about the tower, when it then also becomes not about the tower again.
Right, correct.
So the Tower of Babel matters, but I mean, there's the languages from the thing doesn't sound as nice. The Tower of Babel is a much cleaner name to give it, but not really about pride.
No.
Kind of about the tower, but also not really about the tower. A lot about language.
It's about Bala. I mean, they try to force the etymology in there, because that's where he confused the languages, and they're trying to make that Babel, right? But that's what it's actually about. It's the confusion of languages, and it's the origin of the world's languages. It's their ideology of where language comes from, and that gets picked up again later in the late Second Temple period.
All right, I think we can leave it there for now. Let's say if you have a question that we did not touch on, because there are inevitably versions of this story we're not doing here. We're very limited.
There are more.
There's other questions within this that we didn't touch on as well. So if you have a question about the Tower of Babel, the story, the development of language, whatever it is, put it in the comments, send us an email. We're happy to return. I really love early Genesis stuff.
Oh, yeah.
Like early Genesis stuff is the best. I mean, Genesis might be the best book anyways. Early Genesis stuff is probably my most favorite. So happy to spend as much time here as any of you would like. Bob, thank you for taking the time.
Hey, good subject. Thanks for talking.
Be sure to like and subscribe wherever you find us. It helps us. Hopefully it helps you stay in touch with us. But for this week, for all of us here at Bible and Archaeology, until next time.